Rodeemos el Diálogo is a transnational, non-partisan network of Colombians and Friends of Colombia, founded in September 2012, that works to build an inclusive and comprehensive peace through the promotion of a culture of dialogue. Originally formed in London and with a strong presence in the capital, Bogota, since 2014, we now also have teams in the Colombian cities of Cali and Pasto, and our 100 or so members are working from more than 10 countries across the world. A strong component of our work is that of our thematic teams, focused on the reincorporation process and the different institutions of the comprehensive transitional justice system in Colombia. Those institutions are the Colombian Truth Commission, the Unit for the Search of the Disappeared, and the one that's very pertinent for today, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. These thematic teams have strong academic and practitioner components, and they are, amongst other things, the authors of the series of snapshots that we produce, which are a regular series of short reports that provide insights into developments and issues in those key areas of the peace process. And those teams are also the source of events, such as the one that we are all in today. Over our 9 years of experience in RED, we have identified 6 core principles to allow us to set an example for a more empathetic and responsible society, both with other human beings and with nature. And these are the principles which are going to frame this dialogue between all of us here today. The first of those is honesty, to share what we think openly, truthfully, knowing that it's impossible to trust and overcome division without this. The second of these is generosity, to offer the best of ourselves, to give our time and understanding, to share our knowledge and experiences constructively where they can be of use to others. The third principle is respect for others, whether or not we share the same opinions and values of them, and trying to understand without judgment why they feel and think the way that they do. Our fourth principle is solidarity, with all those fighting to end violence and putting ourselves in the shoes of others and helping as they need. Then we have self-criticism, to be humble, to recognize that our theories, assumptions, and actions may not be right, or that they may not hold in the future, and that we must never stop growing and learning. And finally, co-responsibility, knowing that we must come together with others and draw on what we each have to offer in order to realize a sustainable and lasting peace. Before I hand over to Andre, I just want to offer a few last bits of logistics thinking about how this event is running today, because as you'll see, it's being conducted in English. And on that front, I'd like to take the opportunity now, although I'm sure we will again at the end, to thank Dr. Giovanni, who's assisting with translation for our invited speaker. And in practice, that means that the contributions that our speaker is going to make will be broken into sections that will first be heard in his own voice in Spanish, and then Gwen will do a translation into English immediately after. And the final point I'd make, as everyone is at the moment as well, is to keep microphones off for the moment until you're called on to ask a question, maybe later on in this event. And cameras, it's being recorded as well. If you are going to ask a question later as well, it'd be great to have your camera on so that we can see your faces. But I think other than that, I think we're all set to make a start. So I'll hand back to Andre.
Thank you, Laura, so much for the introduction. And I'm delighted to be chairing this event with Dr. Giovanni Alvarez. On behalf of the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester, I also want to welcome you. And we are delighted to partner with Embrace Dialogue, because one of the key principles of our university is compassion. And because of the work that the unit does, we believe that this is really important to promote compassion around the world because of the suffering of others. So this event is really important because at the center we work on reconciliation and peace building, and we really want to learn from key developments that are taking place in this moment in countries like Colombia. Let me do a very short introduction to Dr. Giovanni Alvarez, who is now the director of the Investigation and Accusation Unit of the HEP, but before that worked for 22 years at the General Prosecutor Office of Colombia. He was a prosecutor in different cases, some related with justice and peace, and also worked in cases related with the Patriotic Union and the search for disappeared in the case of the UP. We were very lucky to have Dr. Giovanni in February 2020 in person in London. So to have him here today online is again a delight, and really looking forward to learn what has happened over the last year and a half in Colombia. So welcome, Dr. Giovanni. I hope that the people who are sitting here join this conversation with you, that we get the chance to hear from you. The idea of this dialogue, as we do them at the center and with Rodemos el Diálogo, is to try to have a space, an informal space of exchange of ideas and learning here. So the structure that we are going to follow in this space is the following. I would start asking a couple of questions to Dr. Giovanni Alvarez. We are going to hear his responses to these questions. We expect that this part of the dialogue would take about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will open the floor for Q&A from the people who have been invited to this dialogue. Please, we ask you to ask your questions in English, because this is an event that is being thought for an English audience and because it would make things easier. So whenever you are asking your questions, Gwen will be translating your questions to Dr. Giovanni Alvarez for him to be able to respond. What we are going to do when Dr. Giovanni is speaking is that we are going to have sequential translation. That means, as Laura said, that he is going to give us an account first in Spanish, and then Gwen would translate into English. And when he has finished responding the first question, we'll move into the second question. If you have the people from the audience or from this dialogue have any questions that come to mind, I'll ask you to keep them for the moment in which we open the Q&A. And we really invite you to ask the questions, turning your cameras on more than writing them on the chat, because what we want to do is to do a dialogue. So the dialogue means voicing, listening, and reflecting about what we are listening, more than just writing lots of questions in the chat section of Zoom. So with that in mind, let us start with the first question for Dr. Giovanni Alvarez. And Giovanni, we've read in the news that since 28th of April, pretty much, there has been a national strike in Colombia, and we have heard that this has had a tremendous impact in Colombian society. We also know that the unit that you direct produced a report trying to explain the impact of the national strike on the transitional justice mechanism in Colombia and the different victims organizations and the people participating of the transitional justice mechanism. Could you please share with us what are the findings of that report, and what should we be aware of what's the impact of this national strike in the transitional justice process in Colombia?
Muchas gracias, Andrei. Si me lo permite, antes de emitir la respuesta a la pregunta que se me ha formulado, quisiera, por supuesto, darles gracias por la invitación a ustedes, a Rodemos el Diálogo, a la Universidad de Winchester, y por supuesto, gracias doy no solo como director de la Unidad de Investigación y Acusación de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, sino como colombiano, a todas las personas que se han unido para participar en este evento que para nosotros es tan importante. Gracias entonces por interesarse por la situación de Colombia y por lo que estamos haciendo en este momento y viviendo, por supuesto, en momentos difíciles.
Before I answer the question, I would just like to say thank you to the University of Winchester, to Rodemos el Diálogo, and to everyone who has joined the event today. As the director of the Investigation and Accusation Unit of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, for organizing this event, and in general also as a Colombian for your interest in Colombian matters at a time of great difficulties for our country.
Para nosotros, en la unidad de investigación y acusación, resultó de gran importancia abordar una tarea que se nos impuso, que fue garantizar la seguridad para las víctimas, testigos y demás intervinientes en el proceso de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz.
For us in the in the investigation and accusation unit, we were given a task, which was to guarantee the security of the victims, witnesses, and all those persons appearing before the Special Jurisdiction for Peace.
Ello implicaba abordar la protección de los comparecientes y las víctimas en el proceso de una forma diferente a como regularmente se venía haciendo en nuestro país.
This meant tackling the issue of protection for those persons appearing before the HIP in a different way than protection has thus far been managed in Colombia.
Por eso nuestra gran apuesta fue crear un sistema integral de protección. Ese sistema integral de protección debería tener por lo menos dos elementos: prevención y protección, para, como les digo, cambiar el paradigma de la protección en Colombia y hacerlo más amplio.
What we did was create a comprehensive protection system which had to have at least two elements. First of all, prevention of violence, and secondly, protection. And this meant changing the paradigm of protection in Colombia.
En ejecución de esa intención, creamos entonces el sistema de prevención con que cuenta la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. Es decir, prevención y protección en un solo sistema para garantizar la participación pacífica y efectiva de víctimas, testigos y demás intervinientes en el proceso de la JEP.
So what we did, we created a unique system which we called the prevention system, joining prevention and protection together in one system in order to guarantee the participation of victims, witnesses, and other people here, participating in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace.
Pensamos que la protección en Colombia no puede ser solo vehículos blindados y de hombres armados, sino que debíamos implementar un mecanismo que nos permitiera prevenir las situaciones de riesgo en que podrían estar los comparecientes y en general los partícipes en el proceso de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz y en general en el sistema integral de verdad, justicia, reparación y garantía de no repetición.
We figured that the protection can't just be limited to things like armored cars and bodyguards. We had to think up a way to actually prevent the risk to people participating in not only the HIP, but in the wider comprehensive system for truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition.
Para ello creamos el sistema de prevención oportuna a riesgos de violaciones a los derechos humanos en nuestro país, que es el grupo de trabajo que produce los informes de prevención que la Unidad de Investigación y Acusación ha publicado en nuestro país, especialmente con la intención de buscar mecanismos, se implementen mecanismos de protección en las zonas y respecto de las personas de interés para el sistema integral de verdad, justicia, reparación y no repetición.
For this, we created the risk prevention system, which includes a working group that produces reports about prevention, which alert authorities to identified risks with the intention of implementing mechanisms of prevention in the territories where these people are.
Y quería, por supuesto, hacer esta pequeña introducción para que, o mejor dicho, para contextualizarlos desde dónde y por qué la Unidad de Investigación y Acusación de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz produce estos informes.
This by way of context to explain to you the context for which the Investigation and Accusation Unit produces these reports.
En ese seguimiento que venimos haciendo a lo que ocurre en Colombia en los últimos tiempos, seguimiento que se hace, por supuesto, las 24 horas del día y los 7 días de la semana, revisando más de 100 medios de comunicación y más de 250 redes sociales, así como información emitida por organismos del Estado colombiano, pues nos ha permitido poder mantenernos al día respecto de lo que está ocurriendo en Colombia en materia de respeto, así como de violación a los derechos humanos en las zonas de interés para la jurisdicción y respecto a las víctimas, testigos y demás intervinientes de la misma.
In this monitoring that we do, we monitor 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We monitor 100 media, normal media. We monitor 250 social networks. And we also receive information from state institutions, of course. And all of this monitoring is looking at the respect of and violations of human rights in the zones that are of interest to the work of the HIP and of the people who are participating in the HEPS mechanisms.
En medio de esta tarea, logramos identificar situaciones en medio de los paros y de las marchas que, por supuesto, nos dejaron inmensamente preocupados. Como por ejemplo, algo que nos impactó muchísimo fue ver que desde que se inició la pandemia, en medio de la protesta social, Colombia es el segundo país con mayor número de personas asesinadas en medio de la protesta social.
With this monitoring, we've identified within the context of the national strike several alarming situations. For example, we identified that in the middle of the pandemic, Colombia has become the second country with the greatest number of people killed involved in social protest.
Nosotros trabajamos con las cifras oficiales, pero también, por supuesto, tenemos la información de las organizaciones de derechos humanos que, digamos, en este caso no son correspondientes, son disímiles. Obtuvimos información oficial de que hay, o en medio de las marchas y de la protesta, 21 personas en Colombia perdieron la vida. Por otra parte, las organizaciones de derechos humanos señalan que no fueron 21, sino 48 seres humanos, 48 colombianos quienes perdieron la vida en medio de la protesta.
We, of course, also work with statistics from human rights organizations, and the official statistics and the statistics from human rights organizations are, of course, not the same. The official information tells us that 21 people have died in the context of the national strike in violent events, but the human rights organizations put that figure at 48 people.
Y por supuesto, cualquiera sea la cifra que tengamos en cuenta, resulta absolutamente alarmante en medio de una democracia, pues que 21 personas, si tomamos la cifra oficial, pierdan la vida en medio de la protesta social, es algo que realmente no debería ocurrir y es inusual en medio de la protesta social.
Of course, whichever statistic we take, even if we take the official number of 21 people, that's still extremely concerning in a democracy. It shouldn't be happening that 21 people are killed in social protest.
Por otra parte, nosotros llevamos ya más de 30 años, casi 40 años, en medio de procesos de paz. Y entendíamos o teníamos la esperanza de que había prácticas que habíamos superado en Colombia y que se hicieron evidentes en medio de las protestas. Pues se logró identificar que en 27 ciudades aparecieron grupos de civiles armados reivindicando prácticas paramilitares que, repito, creíamos ya superadas en nuestro país. gente armada que atacaba a quienes estaban en medio de la protesta social.
We also have spent nearly 40 years in Colombia now in the midst of peace processes, and we had hoped that there were some practices that we had been able to overcome and eliminate. But unfortunately, in the context of the national strike, we've seen them reoccur, including, for example, the practice of paramilitary violence, civilians who have been armed and practicing violence against protesters. And we really thought that we had moved on from paramilitary practices in Colombia.
Pero adicional a ello, encontramos otra práctica que no habíamos identificado anteriormente. Y fue que en medio de la protesta se presentaron 13 casos de violencia sexual. 12 de personas civiles e incluso una funcionaria de la Policía Nacional también fue objeto de violación en medio de las protestas. Es decir, 13 mujeres en los 2 meses que duraron las protestas fueron violadas en medio de las mismas. Una conducta que, por supuesto, nos causó gran escozor.
We also find practices that we haven't identified in social protest before. 13 cases of sexual violence, 12 civilian women and 1 police woman were raped in 2 months of protests, which is of course extremely concerning.
Por otra parte, y ya acercándonos o dirigiéndonos un poco a la respuesta, a la pregunta que nos formulaba Andrei de cómo afectó eso el sistema integral de verdad, justicia, reparación y garantía de no repetición. Quiero además contarles que también se identificó que en medio de las protestas se incrementó el nivel de actos de violencia en las zonas de interés para el sistema integral de verdad, justicia, reparación y garantía de no repetición. ¿Eso qué implica? Que los grupos armados al margen de la ley, esto es, las disidencias, el ELN y otros grupos armados ilegales como el Clan del Golfo y los Pelusos, incrementaron su actividad ilícita en las zonas rurales de nuestro país. Ello seguramente como consecuencia de que la fuerza pública estaba ocupada atendiendo los asuntos de la protesta y facilitó entonces el incremento de la actuación de estos grupos al margen de la ley y por supuesto el dominio de los mismos en zonas de interés para la jurisdicción.
To get now to Andrei's question about how the strike has affected the comprehensive system for truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition, we've discovered that in the midst of the protest, the violence in the zones of interest of this comprehensive system have increased. So illegal armed groups, that is FARC dissidencies, ELN, and others such as the Clan del Golfo, have increased their illegal activities in these regions. And this seems to be a consequence of the armed forces being busy attending to the protests. And so these groups have increased violence and increased their monopoly and power over these territories.
Aumentaron dramáticamente las violaciones a los derechos humanos en las zonas donde se encuentran asentadas comunidades que están participando en el sistema integral y que, por supuesto, ante esta situación se ven intimidadas para poder seguir con su trabajo dentro del proceso de paz.
The human rights violations increased in the areas where there are communities who are participating in the comprehensive system for truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition. Of course, this leads to intimidating them, so they feel less able to participate in those institutions.
Esta situación de zozobra en que están quedando las comunidades rurales, especialmente las comunidades indígenas, afrodescendientes y campesinas de lugares remotos en Colombia, ha dificultado la participación de los mismos en la jurisdicción, pues la preocupación que surge respecto al fortalecimiento de los grupos al margen de la ley, dentro de ellos, por supuesto, las disidencias, hace que las personas sientan temor de participar en el proceso.
This level of panic and fear that the communities feel, and particularly those in rural areas, indigenous, Afro-Colombian and campesino communities, has made their participation in the comprehensive system much more difficult. So they feel very afraid to participate.
Esa, digamos, consideramos la razón por la cual las personas de interés para la jurisdicción y en general para el sistema están siendo afectadas o fueron afectadas en medio de las marchas que se desarrollaron durante 2 meses en nuestro país.
Okay, thank you.
Andrea didn't finish the last bit. Giovanni, ¿me podrías repetir esa última parte, por favor? Estás en mute.
Por supuesto, bueno, sí, les decía que esas, digamos, son las razones por las cuales desde la Unidad de Investigación y Acusación consideramos que lo que ocurrió en medio de las marchas que duraron 2 meses en Colombia afectaron la participación de las víctimas, testigos y demás intervinientes en el sistema integral.
That's the reason that we think, these are the reasons that we believe the participation of victims, witnesses, and other people who participate in the HIP, their participation has been affected during the 2 months of the national strike for these reasons.
Thank you, Gwen. And thank you so much for that, presentation of the context that you gave us about where the reports are written and these important highlights of the findings of this report. In particular, I would like to highlight this very worrying figure that you gave us of more than about 27 civilian armed groups that were created in some of the cities where civilians were using violence to solve problems. I wonder whether you could, knowing, and I'm gonna ask you if you could respond a follow-up question based on this that you just told us before we move into another question. And the reason why I'm gonna ask you this is because at the international level, there is a very serious concern because of the behavior of the Colombian state, in particular, in the middle of the demonstrations. Is there any finding about how the reaction of the Colombian government to the demonstrations had an impact in the context of the national strike for human rights in Colombia and for the mandate of the HEP?
Estás sin micrófono.
Oh, gracias. Bueno, realmente en el informe nosotros fuimos cuidadosos en no referirnos a ese tema por la función que cumplimos dentro del contexto nacional. La Unidad de Investigación y Acusación hace parte de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, que es un órgano de justicia, por eso no quisimos hacer juicios de valor en torno a responsabilidades o no en lo que tiene que ver con las marchas que se presentaron respecto a nadie ni el Estado colombiano. Por supuesto que eso no quiere decir que no pueda decir lo que el informe a las claras señala, y es que por supuesto en medio de la protesta se afectaron gravemente los derechos humanos en Colombia y se evidenció que desafortunadamente la violencia en nuestro país ha venido escalándose cada día más, pues cuando se produjo el acuerdo de paz con la exguerrilla de las FARC, tuvimos un periodo importante de desescalamiento del conflicto que en este momento se está desafortunadamente perdiendo consecuencia de lo que viene pasando, incluyendo, por supuesto, lo ocurrido a lo largo de las protestas. Y por supuesto, para nosotros como colombianos, es preocupante que sea Colombia la primera democracia en el mundo con violencia en medio de la protesta social, pues estamos segundos después de Birmania, que no es una democracia.
We were very careful in the report not to touch on that specific issue because the function that we have in Colombia, we don't have that within our remit as the HIP to produce evaluative judgments about the responsibilities because we're a legal institution. But of course, that doesn't change the fact that the report signals strongly that the human rights situation in Colombia was gravely affected in the strike, and we do note that violence is escalating. There was a period of de-escalation of violence in the around the peace agreement, but now the violence is building again, including within the context of these protests. And it's very worrying that Colombia is, as I said before, the second country in the world which is worst for violence in social protests. It's actually the worst country in the world that is a democracy, because the first country that is worst is, I didn't hear which country it was.
Myanmar.
Oh, Myanmar. And of course, that's not a democracy. So Colombia is the worst democracy in the world for social protest.
Thank you, Dr. Giovanni. That's a really important clarification. Let me move, and really important to hear, this development that has taken place in Colombia and your assessment of how this is having an impact on the HIP. Let's move to a second question of a really important recent development that I think the international community and we in the United Kingdom and other countries around the world would like to hear from you. On the 6th of July this year, less than a month ago, the HIP, charged of war crimes and crimes against humanity, a general and 6 or 9 officers of the Colombian army and a civilian for what is called false positives or extrajudicial killings of civilians in Catatumbo. We have heard that some of the people who were charged have denied responsibility. And one of the things that we would like to understand with you is, what is the investigation and accusation unit of the HIP going to do in these cases? How are we going to make sure that justice is delivered to the victims of this horrendous crime in Colombia, which, according to the numbers of the HIP, are more than 6,402 victims of these extrajudicial killings in the context of the armed conflict in Colombia?
Bueno, muchas gracias por la pregunta, Andrei. Antes de responder la pregunta, si me lo permiten, quisiera referirme unos segundos a lo que implica el trabajo que se ha venido desarrollando en la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz y el alcance de las resoluciones emitidas por los magistrados de la Sala de Reconocimiento de Verdad y Responsabilidad, que constituyen un hito en lo que tiene que ver con materia de justicia transicional en el mundo. Esas resoluciones, por supuesto, son...
When?
Okay, no, before responding specifically to that question, I just want to explain a little bit about the work of the HIP and the scope of the resolutions emitted by the Chamber of Recognition and Responsibilities within the HIP, because this work is landmark work and groundbreaking in the world in terms of transitional justice.
Esas resoluciones constituyen el paso más grande que ha dado la jurisdicción en desarrollo del cumplimiento de los 4 pilares que constituyen la misma, que son esclarecimiento de la verdad, aplicar justicia, lograr la reparación y la garantía de no repetición para las víctimas. Por eso, antes de responder la pregunta respecto de qué va a hacer la unidad de investigación y acusación con aquellas personas que no acepten la responsabilidad, no podía dejar de referirme a la importancia de las decisiones que se vienen tomando al interior de la jurisdicción, que por supuesto son el mecanismo impulsor del trabajo de la misma.
Those resolutions are the biggest step in fulfilling the 4 pillars of the comprehensive system of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition, the 4 pillars of transitional justice, which are, of course, the clarification of truth, the application of justice, achieving reparations for the victims, and guaranteeing non-repetition. So before I move to explain what happens to those people who don't accept responsibility, I want to explain a bit about the role of those decisions in motivating and propelling the wider work of the HIP.
En lo que corresponde a la unidad de investigación y acusación y la tarea que nos viene hacia adelante, debo decirle que nosotros llevamos 3 años funcionando. En esos 3 años hemos diseñado una estrategia de trabajo para abordar los casos que nos han de corresponder, que por supuesto, desde ya debo decirles, por la naturaleza de los mismos, son difíciles de investigar.
In what regards the investigation and accusation unit, we've been working now for 3 years, and we've designed a strategy to deal with those cases that are assigned to us, which by nature are extremely difficult cases.
Sin embargo, como les decía, en estos 3 años hemos diseñado una estrategia que tiene 3 puntos importantes que nos van a facilitar adelantar investigaciones ágiles y eficientes. Ello tiene 3 elementos, como les dije, que son los siguientes. La preparación de la investigación, que lleva ya 3 años, nos ha permitido construir un contexto histórico del conflicto en Colombia. Y un contexto histórico del conflicto en Colombia basado en lo que ha venido ocurriendo y cuál ha sido el desarrollo de los grupos al margen de la ley en Colombia, pero por supuesto también cuál ha sido el desarrollo y el crecimiento de las fuerzas regulares del Estado, llámese fuerza pública, en nuestro país.
The strategy has 3 elements. The first is the importance we give to the preparation of the investigations, a long-term context analysis based on analyzing the development of illegal armed groups in the country over time, and also the state forces, the armed forces in Colombia.
Ello, y ya para centrarme en el tema de la fuerza pública, nos ha permitido saber cómo creció la fuerza pública en Colombia, qué zonas fue ocupando, cuáles eran las jerarquías de mando que existían y por supuesto también hacerle un seguimiento a los procesos que se han adelantado en nuestro país en materia de violaciones a los derechos humanos e infracciones al DIH por parte de miembros de la misma.
In particular, as we're talking about actions carried out by the armed forces, in this context analysis, we've been able to track how the armed forces have grown and expanded in different Colombia, the regions they have occupied, the chains of command, and of course the human rights violations that they have been involved in or implicated in.
Pero por supuesto que esa información que hemos recopilado, organizado y esquematizado durante este tiempo va a ser explotada por los equipos de trabajo que se crearon al interior de la misma. Entonces, debo decirles que tenemos un equipo de fiscales que son expertos en investigaciones de graves violaciones a los derechos humanos, infracciones al DIH y, por supuesto, genocidio, acompañados de funcionarios de policía judicial que son expertos también en investigaciones de casos de esta naturaleza. Pero ellos serán apoyados por un equipo de analistas de contexto que son unos profesionales en las ciencias sociales que se han dedicado a estudiar el conflicto en Colombia y a entender el mismo de cara a poder adelantar las investigaciones que nos permitan cumplir con las expectativas que tiene la comunidad nacional e internacional en materia de justicia y garantía de las víctimas del conflicto en Colombia.
This information that we compiled is exploited by work teams that we have. We have a team of prosecutors who are expert in cases relating to grave human rights violations and genocide. They're accompanied by judicial police who have experience working on cases of this nature, and also context analysts who have social science backgrounds who are experienced in analyzing the armed conflict in Colombia.
Y el tercer elemento con el que contamos y al que ya me referí cuando hablaba en la respuesta a la pregunta anterior, tiene que ver con un esquema diferente de protección. En el desarrollo de ese esquema diferente de protección se creó el grupo de prevención. El grupo de prevención realiza una tarea que nos va a permitir identificar testigos importantes en materia de verdad, pero también como vamos a investigar hechos que ocurrieron hace muchos años, pero en un entorno actual y difícil, también vamos a saber de qué manera vamos a abordar las investigaciones, porque vamos a poder saber cuál es la situación particular de orden público que se está desarrollando en las zonas de interés investigativo para la jurisdicción y, por supuesto, para la unidad de investigación y acusación.
The third element, which I already mentioned in response to the first question, is the innovative protection scheme that we have. So our group of prevention is working on things, is doing work to identify potential witnesses for the cases that we're investigating. Obviously, these are in many cases have happened many years ago. So they have to identify not only people who can testify about these things, but they have to do so with an eye to the delicate security situation that these people might be in places where the public order and security situation is very delicate. So it's important to know both of these things in this investigation work.
Ello lo desarrollaremos en un entorno de garantía para todos los partícipes en el proceso, porque este proceso es un proceso de reconciliación para lograr una paz estable y duradera. De manera que habrá garantías para todos, partiendo de las víctimas que son el centro del proceso, pero también para los comparecientes, porque debe ser una justicia, por supuesto, ejemplar que permita la reconciliación nacional. Por eso, si me lo permite, Andrei, terminaré esta respuesta con el eslogan de la unidad: seremos implacables en la búsqueda de la verdad y firmes con la reconciliación.
We do this work while guaranteeing all, while trying to ensure guarantees for all participants in the case, because this is, of course, a justice that seeks to contribute to a broader process of reconciliation in the country. So we want to guarantee the security not just of the victims, who, of course, have are supposed to be always at the center of the whole peace process, but also the safety and integrity of the accused, because the idea is that this is a restorative justice process. And I will finish the answer to this question with the motto of the unit, which is implacable in the search for truth and firm in the search for reconciliation.
Thanks, Gwen, and thank you, Dr. Giovanni. That's fantastic. Let me do another follow-up question to try to ask you something that people outside Colombia don't understand, and is related with this. According to what we have heard in the transitional justice mechanism in Colombia, the perpetrators who accept responsibility will receive reduced sentences. And in most cases, if they accept total responsibility and they contribute to truth and reparations, they won't have to pay jail time. That's a fantastic benefit from these people. Were you expecting the officers of the Colombian army to deny responsibility in a case like this? Is this something normal? It was expected that this was going to happen, or is a surprise for you?
Caramba, Andrei. Debo decirle que para mí no es una sorpresa. Parto de ahí. Para mí no es una sorpresa. Sin embargo, por supuesto, cuando uno estudia el proceso, esperaría que todo aquel que comparezca al mismo viniera a contribuir decididamente con la construcción de la verdad y a cumplir con los 4 pilares de la misma, es decir, verdad, justicia, reparación y no repetición. Porque bien lo ha dicho usted, que es muy conocedor del proceso. Ofrece muchos, pero muchos beneficios a los comparecientes, obvio, a cambio de que cumplan con los 4 compromisos que se requieren para obtener los mismos. Sin embargo, pues yo he tenido experiencia en justicia transicional y desde que llegué acá, luego de haber estado en la Fiscalía y particularmente desarrollando el proceso de justicia y paz, tenía la convicción, que espero no sea o que no llegue a niveles muy altos, de que por supuesto muchas personas y por muchos hechos graves no iba a haber aceptación de responsabilidad.
Unfortunately for me, it was not a surprise. One would expect that everybody would come to contribute and would accept responsibility in response to, in exchange for these great benefits that are offered, and many benefits that are offered to the accused, so long as they contribute to committing to the clarification of truth and the 4 pillars of transitional justice. But unfortunately, as I've got experience in transitional justice in the prosecutor's office in the Justice and Peace process, because of that experience, I knew that there would be many people who would not wish to come forward and accept responsibility.
En un proceso que investiga las violaciones a los derechos humanos ocurridas en un conflicto tan extremadamente largo como el nuestro. Seguramente se ha intronizado en la mente de muchos colombianos que algunas conductas podían ser las adecuadas para un momento determinado en nuestro país. Y ello hace pensar a muchas personas que no deberían responder ante la comunidad nacional e internacional por situaciones graves que ocurrieron en nuestro país. Y en desarrollo de este proceso, una de nuestras tareas es hacerles entender la gravedad de los mismos y la importancia de que se asuman responsabilidades por ello, porque de otra manera no vamos a poder lograr la reconciliación y la recomposición que la sociedad colombiana requiere para lograr un país mejor.
In a process that is investigating human rights violations in such a long-standing conflict as this, many people, many Colombians have come to believe that some behaviors are correct, are justifiable, and that therefore they shouldn't have to respond or take responsibility for them. And one of our tasks is really to make them understand the gravity of these behaviors and actions and get them to accept responsibility for them.
Thank you, Dr. Giovanni. That's a fantastic answer to that question. And let me then go to the next question before we open the floor for Q&A from the people who are here in this meeting. The question that I would like to ask you has to do with the FARC now, because it seems a bit paradoxical, or is the opposite situation, to put it in a different way, than what is happening with the army. Because in the case of the FARC, in the case number 001 that has to do with kidnapping, the members of the FARC's secretariat has already accepted full responsibility for the war crimes they have been charged. And they have also committed to fully do a full reparation of the victims. That means that the unit that you direct has to prepare the ground for the sentences, or the way how these members of the FARC will have to go back to some of the territories and carried out alternative punishments to rebuild the social fabric in these regions and to reparate the victims. So I would like to ask you if you could tell us a bit about what have been the developments. How is the unit preparing the ground for these sort of activities that will probably start taking place very soon? And if you could tell us when that's going to happen, I'm pretty sure that we will appreciate that.
Bueno, ese es un tema fundamental de cara a la reconciliación nacional, porque es indudable que sin reparación difícilmente va a haber reconciliación. No obstante que, por supuesto, la verdad y la justicia son puntos de fundamental importancia. ¿Y cómo contribuye la unidad de investigación y acusación en esta materia? Hay dos mecanismos a través de los cuales nosotros vamos a contribuir en ello. En lo que tiene que ver en desarrollo del proceso ideológico, que es al cual usted se ha referido, nosotros a través del grupo de prevención hacemos seguimiento a lo que viene ocurriendo en la zona de interés para la jurisdicción. Ello implica que estamos identificando los riesgos en los puntos geográficos en los cuales seguramente se van a desarrollar los TOARs. Pero además también, por supuesto, buscando prevenir la no repetición de hechos victimizantes a los que han sufrido los rigores del conflicto.
Giovanni, ¿qué son los TOARs?
Trabajos y obras con contenido reparador. Perdón. Justicia restaurativa. Sí, es justicia restaurativa.
Perfecto. Okay, so this is a really fundamental issue for reconciliation in Colombia, because without reparations, it is difficult to imagine a full reconciliation in Colombia, although of course the truth and justice part are already very important. The Investigation and Accusation Unit is participating in this process via two mechanisms. First of all, in the dialogic process to determine the alternative punishments, which Andrea, you mentioned in the question, we are participating via the prevention group, which is monitoring closely the zones of interest for the system, trying to identify the risks in different geographic points where the punishments, which are called the work and jobs and constructions with reparative content. That's I'll try and think of a slightly better English translation for that later. But anyway, the work that is going to be done by the people who receive the sentences to contribute to reparations. We're trying to basically work out what the risks are in those geographic areas where they might be doing some of that work, and also with an eye to ensuring non-repetition of violence in those regions.
Microphone.
Por ejemplo, nosotros en desarrollo de esta tarea hemos emitido un informe respecto al municipio de Anorí, que es un municipio tobar, y se identificó una zona en particular de ese municipio donde se aconsejó, atendiendo la situación de orden público, que no se hicieran obras, por lo menos en este momento. Porque podrían ocurrir situaciones que constituyeran violaciones a los derechos humanos para los comparecientes que iban a cumplir con esa tarea, pero también, por supuesto, a las víctimas de los mismos.
For example, we recently provided a report in this process about the municipality of Anorí in Antioquia, which is where we made a recommendation about a specific geographic area in the municipality where we recommended that at the moment it wouldn't be a good idea for the punishments to be carried out in this place because of a security situation that could lead to human rights violations of the accused and also of the victims.
Por otra parte, en sede del proceso de justicia que adelantamos nosotros o el que se desarrollará al interior de la unidad de investigación y acusación, es decir, en sede del proceso adversarial, nosotros tenemos dos obligaciones fundamentales. La primera es mantener una comunicación fluida y permanente con las víctimas. Pero además, en el evento en que presentemos una acusación, en esa acusación debemos incluir la identificación de los daños sufridos por las víctimas. Es decir, que debemos acompañar a la víctima en todo el proceso desde el inicio hasta el final, de cara a que se cumpla con todo aquello a que tiene derecho, es decir, verdad, justicia, reparación, pues para ello se identifican los daños y por supuesto la expectativa de reparación que las víctimas tienen y finalmente la no repetición. Para ello recurriremos a los mecanismos con que cuenta la Unidad de Investigación y Acusación con sus equipos de policía judicial y por supuesto con el equipo de prevención oportuna a riesgo de violaciones a los derechos humanos.
In regards to the adversarial process, which is different from the dialogic process, when we make an accusation against someone, we have two obligations. The first is constant communication with victims. When we make an accusation, we must identify the harm suffered by the victims and accompany them through the whole process, ensuring their right to the four pillars of truth, justice, reparations, and non-repetition are respected and fulfilled. And for that, we accompany them with the mechanisms that we have in the unit of the team of judicial police and the team of prevention of human rights violations.
Y por supuesto, en general nosotros como parte de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz estaremos siempre prontos con todo nuestro equipo a apoyar las actividades que la magistratura requiera en esa materia, porque este es un proceso de justicia restaurativa y esta parte del mismo resulta fundamental para poder lograr el objetivo que se quiere dentro de este proceso, que es un proceso de justicia nuevo en nuestro país. Pasamos de la justicia retributiva a la restaurativa, de manera que fundamental es que se cumpla con la reparación a las víctimas y la reconstrucción social en el desarrollo del mismo.
Our whole team is also always on call to support anything that the magistrates of the HIP are need us to do, because this is part this restorative justice process that we are carrying out in Colombia is a new justice paradigm in Colombia. We're moving from a retributive justice to a restorative justice, which is focused very much on trying to achieve the end goals of reparation and restoration of the social fabric.
Dr. Giovanni, thank you so much. I think, there are plenty of questions there, but I don't want to carry on doing this. I'm aware of the time, and I'm aware that I had also promised to some of the to the people who decided to join this event to have a chance to ask some questions. So I think this is the moment for you, the people in this space, to let me know in the chat or to put your hand up to ask a question to Giovanni. I've seen that Louise Winstanley wrote a question in the chat. She wasn't here when I asked the people to please ask the question, voicing it. So probably, Louise, could I ask you to ask the question aloud for Gwen to be able to translate it, or do you want me to or do you want me, Gwen, to do the translation straight away?
It's okay, Andre. I'm happy to read it out. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Louise, go ahead.
I wanted to say that Colombia, I think, in the peace accord, took an important world lead in declaring no amnesties for conflict-related sexual violence. The HEP has taken an important decision to apply a gender and ethnic perspective to all cases. However, this on its own will not address the truth, justice, and reparation and no repetition, as well as an understanding of the level and pattern and extent of sexual violence that women have suffered in the Colombian conflict. So I'd be very interested to know if the HEP has any plans to have a macro case on conflict-related sexual violence in the Colombian conflict. And I think this is probably important not only for Colombian women, which it is, but also globally, because whatever Colombia does on this issue will set the bar for the rest of the world.
Thank you, Louise. That's fantastic. So We're going to go to Giovanni to answer this question. And in the meantime, I invite the rest of the people here to put your hand up or to let me know in the chat if you will be willing to ask another question for taking the opportunity that Giovanni is here with us today.
Gracias por la pregunta, Luis. Es una pregunta muy importante en la que quiero, o para la que quiero partir de varias cosas. Primero, que la violencia sexual, por supuesto, no puede ser objeto de amnistía o indulto dentro del proceso de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. Y segundo, que todas las actuaciones de la jurisdicción tienen transversalizado los principios de género. De manera que nosotros, aunque aún en la jurisdicción no se ha aperturado un caso autónomo de violencia sexual, sí quiero decirles que junto con los magistrados de la Sala de Reconocimiento de Verdad y Responsabilidad, que serán quienes finalmente decidan en qué momento resulte oportuna la apertura del caso, sé que al interior de la misma se vienen desarrollando diversas discusiones de cara a decidir en qué momento se abrirá el caso de violencia sexual en sede del proceso de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. De manera que tengo la convicción y la confianza que ese caso se va a abrir. Es un caso que, por supuesto, entiendo, los magistrados han llevado con mucho cuidado por la dificultad que implica la investigación de esta conducta que ha sido tradicional en todos los conflictos en el mundo. Pero quiero decirle, Luis, que seguro estoy de que el caso se va a abrir. Los magistrados están, repito, estudiando el momento oportuno en el que él se vaya a hacer. Sin embargo, por supuesto, hay en otros casos donde se viene revisando de manera transversal la violencia sexual, tales como en los casos de desaparición forzada, así como en los de reclutamiento ilícito de menores para el conflicto.
Okay. Thank you so much for that question. It's a really important one. So sexual violence in the context of the conflict cannot ever be amnestied by the HIP. That's the first important point to signal. And secondly, all actions by the HIP have a gender focus as transversal. That's the second important point that we have to make. So we haven't yet opened a case in the HIP about sexual violence in the conflict, but in the unit, together with the judges, who are the people who will decide when and how to open any case, internally within the HIP, there are many discussions to try to decide when it's convenient, when it's a good moment to open a case. I'm absolutely sure that there will be a case opened on sexual violence. The judges have managed it with a lot of care because of the difficulty of investigating it in any conflict in the world, but I'm sure it will be opened. Of course, in other cases, it's present as a pattern of violence transversely. So we have situations that are about sexual violence in the case on forced disappearances and in the case on forced recruitment.
Thank you, Dr. Giovanni, for that response. I see that Sonia wrote a question in the chat. Sonia, I wonder whether the response that Dr. Giovanni has given us is enough for you, or whether you would like to still ask your question, and whether you would like to voice your question to him for Gwen to be able to translate it and to clarify if you would like for him to expand in any specific point. Yeah. Sonia is saying that the question has been answered by Giovanni, so that she doesn't need a further clarification. I wonder if someone else would like to ask a question in this moment with any other, related with any other of the points that we have been discussing so far. I'm gonna leave it open for the time being, but I would like to probably then take this opportunity, Giovanni, to ask you another. Gwen wants to ask a question in particular, and Luis is thanking you for your answer, Giovanni. So let's do this. She's gonna have a hard time. Probably she already is telling you what she's gonna ask, but she's gonna ask the question in English for everyone to know what is that you are gonna respond.
Okay, I'm taking advantage of the pause to be a participant in this discussion as well as a translator. I would like to ask Giovanni, with regards to the alternative sentencing of the FARC that you discussed. Obviously, this is a really important point for public opinion in Colombia, because one of the main controversies in the peace process was the non-jail time. And one of the things that I believe is still around which the country is still most polarized is the FARC not paying jail time. And I wonder how you're managing or how you're analyzing the importance of doing something symbolic that will show Colombian society that there is justice being done through this process, and balancing that with the needs of the victims. Now I'm going to do the same question in Spanish.
Put your microphone in silence, Gwen.
Thank you.
Giovanni, I just want to make you aware of the time. We have about 7 minutes left. So I'm gonna add a question to Gwen that I just is related. So probably you could try to answer the last one connected to this, and has to do with, yesterday we found out that another member of the FARC was killed. I mean, this week, at least 2 members of the FARC, or former combatants of the FARC, have been killed. Is it possible to guarantee security to these people in these regions where they are going to be trying to do, restorative work for the victims?
Caramba, qué buena pregunta. La primera. Y la segunda, qué pregunta tan difícil. Pero, por supuesto, van de la mano las dos. Nosotros en Colombia hemos hecho una gran apuesta por el cambio de paradigma de justicia. Y es pasar de la justicia retributiva a la justicia restaurativa. Y hay varios aspectos que tal vez sería importante ver. Y es que la solución al conflicto en Colombia, indudablemente, creo que es la que estamos desarrollando, y era la negociación. No sé si, Gwen, ahí dice, y después continúo.
Dale. Okay, so these 2 questions are very difficult, and yet they go together. We have tried very hard in this whole peace process to change the whole paradigm of justice from a paradigm of retributive justice to one of restorative justice. It's absolutely clear that the solution to the conflict in Colombia has to be the one that we've been following, which is that of negotiation.
Es indudable que ese proceso de negociación necesariamente implica, como toda una negociación, que cada una de las partes ceda en algo. Pero yo entendería que lo más importante en esta negociación es lograr el objetivo final, y es alcanzar una paz estable y duradera. Es inconcebible que un país que lleva 60 años en conflicto no busque la paz, y que nosotros los colombianos no nos comprometamos con la misma. Debo decirles antes de llegar digamos al centro, la respuesta, que es una deuda que nosotros, nuestra generación, tiene con las generaciones futuras de este país. Entonces, bueno,
quickly.
Sí.
All negotiations require each side to cede in something. The most important, I think, is to achieve the ultimate objective of these negotiations, which is, of course, the construction of a stable and lasting peace. A country that's been living 60 years of war has to seek peace, and all Colombians must contribute to it. It's a debt that our generation has with the next generation.
De manera que un país que vive la situación que vivimos nosotros, con, digamos, grandes, o no con grandes, con difíciles situaciones de orden público, o condiciones mejor de orden público, en el que se desarrollan distintas actividades ilícitas y perviven economías ilegales, tiene que indudablemente buscar la solución a los problemas que tiene. Las cárceles de Colombia están saturadas de presos, y gústenos o no, los mecanismos que se han implementado tradicionalmente no han servido para la reincorporación social de aquellos que cumplen sanciones al interior de los centros carcelarios.
A country living this situation has to seek a solution. Colombia's, with all of its difficult security situations, the illicit activities, the illegal economies, Colombia's jails are absolutely full of prisoners, and unfortunately the traditional justice mechanisms have not helped with the reintegration of these prisoners into society.
Además surge una pregunta, y es: ¿qué ganan las víctimas y qué ganan finalmente la sociedad cuando se aplican únicamente sanciones penales sin tener en cuenta el interés real de quien ha sufrido el daño? Eso es lo que estamos haciendo en este proceso. Por eso las víctimas son el centro del mismo, y ellas pueden participar en ese proceso de establecimiento de mecanismos de justicia restaurativa. Se les va a escuchar, y son ellas y la sociedad en Colombia, las comunidades, las que van a fijar los parámetros finalmente de cómo va a ser el mecanismo de reparación que ellas quieren.
What do the victims and what does the society at large actually gain when only penal sanctions are applied without considering the experiences and suffering of the victims, who are at the center of the process? The victims can participate in the mechanisms of restorative justice, and they're the ones who ultimately fix and determine the parameters of the mechanisms of reparation that they want.
la participación de las víctimas en todo, a lo largo del proceso, en la construcción del mismo y en el establecimiento de los mecanismos de reparación, va a hacer que la víctima se sienta realmente reconocida y reparada por el daño que se le ha causado. Además, porque lo que se busca con este proceso, como les decía, que es un proceso de reconciliación, también es un proceso de reconstrucción del tejido social, lo cual yo sueño con que se cumpla y que podamos tener un sistema social mucho más justo y donde haya más oportunidades, especialmente para aquellas personas que a lo largo de tantos años han sufrido los rigores del conflicto que nos ha tocado vivir en Colombia.
The participation of victims throughout the entire process of the transitional justice and the establishment of the mechanisms of reparation means that they will feel recognized and they will feel that reparation has been done to them by participating all the way through. And the process of reconciliation is also a process of reconstruction of the social fabric. And it is my hope that we can build a more just social system with more opportunities for those who've suffered the atrocities of war.
Por otra parte, en lo que tiene que ver con la garantía de participación y la seguridad para los excombatientes de las FARC que han aceptado responsabilidad y que se han sometido a la justicia y a la jurisdicción, y que, por supuesto, tendrá que participar en el proceso de justicia restaurativa y en las labores de reparación a las víctimas. Toda la actividad que desarrollamos en la jurisdicción desde los mecanismos de prevención que nos han permitido identificar lo que viene ocurriendo en Colombia con los excombatientes que, tristemente debo decirlo, pierde la vida un excombatiente cada 5 días en nuestro país. Es algo que es preocupante. Por eso, desde la magistratura y por supuesto con el apoyo de la Unidad de Investigación y Acusación, se vienen desarrollando mecanismos que buscan, a través de medidas cautelares, crear entornos de seguridad para las zonas y las personas de interés para la jurisdicción. De manera que finalmente lograremos en la jurisdicción vincular a todos los órganos del Estado y del gobierno que tienen la obligación de garantizar la seguridad de todos los ciudadanos. Dentro de ellos, por supuesto, a los excombatientes de las FARC que vienen cumpliendo con el proceso de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz y que habrán de cumplir en zonas, por supuesto, difíciles del país, las labores o trabajos y obras con contenido reparador.
With regards to the guarantees of security for the members of the FARC who are participating, who of course are going to have to contribute, who are going to have to play their part in contributing to truth-telling, it is of a great concern to us. Unfortunately, every 5 days there is an ex-combatant of the FARC assassinated. The activity of the magistrates of the HIB and the unit, the investigation and accusation unit, are designing mechanisms to address this. We are designing precautionary measures for people and regions of interest for the work that we're doing. And these precautionary measures will bring together all of those state organs which are responsible for protecting civilians, and we will encourage them or require them to ensure that members of the FARC who are in these regions carrying out the works that are contributing to reparations are protected.
Quiero terminar, perdón, Andrei, quisiera terminar diciéndoles que tenemos una labor grande, sé difícil, y es lograr cambiar la mentalidad de lo que entendemos por justicia. Esta es una justicia restaurativa, que es una justicia más social y más justa con las víctimas. Por eso la importancia de las mismas. Por eso la importancia de esta justicia, que realmente sí va a tener unos impactos reales con aquellos que han sufrido los rigores del conflicto en Colombia.
I finish by saying that we have a really, really huge and difficult task, and that is to change the mentalities of what Colombians understand by justice. This is a restorative justice, which is a more socially oriented justice, and one which is in fact more just with the victims and will have a real impact on those who have suffered great harms in the conflict.
Giovanni, it's been a pleasure to have you here. We at the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace study reconciliation and try to follow up the developments in countries like Colombia. Colombia is one of the case studies that we have, because understanding reconciliation processes is very, very complex. I think today you have given us a lot of food for thought for us to continue thinking about that. I hope that the students of our Masters on Religion, Reconciliation and Peace have learned from this. And I would like to highlight at least 4 lessons, 4 things that I take with me out of this dialogue with you. The first one is this very worrying alarm that you told us, that civilians have been arming themselves in cities of Colombia at taking justice in their own hands, and that has resulted in serious levels of violence. I think that's something very concerning and a very serious obstacle for reconciliation in Colombia, and hopefully the levels of stigmatization that have been created that sometimes infuse this violence carried out by civilians could be reduced. The second thing that I have learned from you, and that I hope we can take, is that the unit of investigation and accusation of the head has been carrying out investigations, research for the last 3 years on how the Colombian army was carrying out particular practices across the country, so that if members of the army deny responsibility, you have enough evidence, and you have the prosecutors, the police, and you have the context analysis specialist who would be able to prove that these people participated in the charges that they have been accused of. Third, you have said that you have been monitoring closely the risk security, the risk of important regions of the country in which the FARC would be paying restorative sentences. And you have said that in cases like Anorí, in particular sectors of this municipality, you have advised that that the FARC don't pay restorative sentences there because there are not security guarantees, which shows that you have been doing a really important monitoring analysis of the different regions of the country for this to happen. Fourth, I think you have mentioned in particular towards the end the importance of changing the mentality of Colombians in order to be able to reconcile. That Colombians, unlike many other societies moving from war to peace, need to replace a retributive justice approach for a restorative justice approach that puts at the center the needs of the victims and the reparation of the victims in order to have their life project back. And fifth, probably I'm going to add one more, is that you have said that you are very aware of the security situation of the members of the FARC. You have told us that every 5 days, a former combatant of the FARC is being killed in Colombia, and that you are trying to create with the whole special jurisdiction for peace what you call security zones, in which all the different institutions of the Colombian state and the transitional justice system work together to try to offer security to the former combatants and to the people living in those areas. So these are important developments. You give us a light of hope in the middle of very, very serious concerns that many Colombians and the international community have about the developments of the peace process in Colombia, now that we are getting close to the 5 years of the signing of the peace agreement. We hope that in 2022, the political environment changes in Colombia, helping the transitional justice mechanism to do the work much better. And we wish you all the success in the coming years, because we know that the special jurisdiction for peace will continue to work for the next 15 years at least, trying to deliver justice for the victims. With that in mind, I would like to invite the participants to this event to turn their cameras on, if you will, and to give a round of applause to Giovanni for coming here with us today and for sharing with honesty and responsibility all these important developments of the investigation and accusation unit of the HEP. So Giovanni, thank you very much for joining Rodemos el Diálogo.
Oh, gracias a ustedes por la invitación, por participar y por preocuparse por Colombia. Muchas gracias, de verdad.
Thank you so much to all of you for the invitation, for coming, and for your concern about Colombia.
Brilliant. See you in the next event, all of you. Thanks so much for coming on behalf of Winchester and on behalf of Rodemos el Diálogo. Have a great end of the day.
Thank you.